Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Faith Church Podcast. I am your host, Jay Williams, and joining me today, as per usual, is Jeff Clossy.
Hello, Jay.
Hello. Hello, Jay. That sounds like the neighbor from Tool Time.
Tim Allen and what was the neighbor's name?
Oh, no.
Al?
Al?
Oh, no. Someone's like,
no, Al is his
guys.
best friend. Al is his best friend.
Yeah,
Wilson.
Yeah, thanks.
How could you
It's been a
forget that?
long time.
It's been
Wow.
so long. There's a little blast from the past.
That's funny that came to your mind.
Yeah, like, hello, neighbor. That's what it sounded like. So, and that would be fitting because you're kind of the wise sage of the office, and I'm the impulsive, like, more power kind of guy.
Right.
It feels like that a little bit. Sometimes I do feel like the Tim Allen of the office. Although usually it's Michael Scott.
Yeah.
That's usually what people are saying.
So this morning, speaking of Michael Scott, I was at Menards early in the morning, which is actually my new favorite time of going there. Normally, I don't know where I'm going, right, in Menards. And when you go at 8 o'clock in the morning, there's no one there. It's just amazing. Like, you can find your way around easily, and all the employees are still in great moods because they haven't had any hard encounters yet. Whatever, it's great. So this morning, there's this like magazine area on the way out, and there's one that has like Kevin from The Office, and it's all chili recipes. And Liam was with me, and he didn't know what that was referring to, so we had to find the YouTube video of Kevin spilling the chili, and I could not stop laughing, even though I've seen it so many times, that scene.
That scene does not make me laugh. I can't laugh at it.
Oh, really?
It's
I
too
think it's
heartbreaking. It's too like. And I'm
well,
the
that's
guy
why.
I know. I get it. Like, it's funny because normally I have no conscience when it comes to that, but that just like it gets me every time. I feel so badly for him. You're talking about Menards. Whenever I go to Menards, I feel like everyone's staring at me and thinking what a moron I am. I try really hard to pretend like I know what I'm doing, even though I have no idea where I am or what's going on, and I'm looking for things, and I try to be, I try to go way under the radar. I hate it when people ask me if I need any help, because I think what goes through my mind is you are not prepared to handle all the help I actually need, so it's kind of, it feels all or nothing. Because if I
How much time do you have?
Right, because like if I ask them a question about something, they're going to, like 9 times out of 10, they're going to say an answer that I can't comprehend. That I have to like, it reminds me of again from The Office, when he says like, explain it to me like I'm an 8-year-old, and then they explain it like that, and then you explain it like I'm a 4-year-old. It's like, I can't. I still don't understand.
I've had those experiences there too. I knew what I needed this morning though, and it was easy in and out. So no one else starts shopping then though, because I like it how it is.
I think I need to. Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm sure if all of our podcast listeners start Masters, there'll be like a national news story of Menards realizing like having a big customer push and
we're sending them all.
They have to like we gotta expand our hours. Like, well, it was all started here, folks. So. All right. Well, speaking of explaining things like you're a 4-year-old, that's how I feel like when I'm reading scripture sometimes. Like when I read the Sermon on the Mount, and when I read, which we're going to be starting here in a couple weeks.
So excited about this.
Very excited. I often feel like asking that question to Jesus of, okay, explain. Like, it's almost like he's doing that with the kingdom of someone saying like, okay, explain it to me like I'm an 8-year-old. And then he gives the Sermon on the Mount. You're like, okay, explain it to me like I'm a 4-year-old. I'm going to actually use that.
Yeah,
and then
that's good.
Then I'll be able to determine how many listeners we actually have by people who look like they've heard that line before. But I feel that way a little bit with the countercultural. So this week we talked about culture and the importance of culture, which I really tried to drive that home. That number one, how critical culture is, because it's so common to ignore it or to think that culture develops around your goals and your mission and your all that, and it doesn't really. It's something that you have to intentionally cultivate. Any more than we've been using the garden illustration, but the soil in your garden is not going to become hospitable to tomatoes just because you start planting tomato seeds. Like you have to. There's a lot of work that has to be done in that, and it is like It's the unseen. It's so much of the unseen work. And then all of a sudden you're like, wow, there's fruit. And I feel like we've been seeing that a lot in the church lately, where we're seeing fruit that we think, man, where'd that come from? And you realize, well, that's coming from this culture, this like kingdom culture that's being cultivated. And so that's really exciting. But at the same time, even as I say that, when we were looking at different things that Jesus said about the kingdom, and the culture that forms, the first one I mentioned, that it's upside down, is still like is the context for all of them, because they just don't always make sense.
No, they don't. It's interesting how the way we're talking about culture right now too takes thoughtful, intentional action, and like to not go a certain direction, but to go this direction, the direction of the kingdom. But on the other side of it, it ends up being automatic. It ends up being what you don't realize you're deciding, because it's already part of the culture.
Yeah.
And that's what's challenging about it. And when Jesus starts talking about, loving your enemies and not hating them,
Right.
which could feel automatic, it feels very upside down. It's just different than the way we're accustomed, I think, not only to living in the world, but to other people living around us, like responding to us. Mm-hmm. So a person responding to a mistake we make, so say we cut someone off in traffic unintentionally, we know what the response will be if we look up, so we don't want to look up.
Right.
And that's unfortunately the way of the world. The upside down way would be receiving that, like Jesus says, what does he say to do to people who curse you? Well, to bless them. Like that is the upside down way.
Right. Because it throws everything off. That reminds me that Lauren wanted to invent an I'm sorry honk for the horn. Like she wishes that there were two horn honks, and one is the assertive one, and the other one is the I'm sorry, like oops. Because it is hard. Like when you, if you have, I think all of us have had the experience where we've cut somebody off, or that we've done something where we're like, oh no, if I was that guy, I'd be super frustrated. And you want to try to communicate. Usually a wave is the thing, but it would be so great if you had just like a little, I'm sorry.
I agree. So much of this gets played out in that situation behind the wheel.
Like,
oh man, were my brights really on for that whole stretch? Like, oh boy.
Oh
wish
gosh,
I could go back and apologize.
Oh man,
Yeah,
and it's so funny because you do that, and then someone like flashes their brights at you, and you're like, I'm sorry, and which I always say, but that's.
I'm with Lauren. We do need that honk.
You need the I'm sorry. I'm sorry honk. Okay, well that's not what this podcast is about. But you're right. It's counterintuitive. But here's the interesting thing: is I feel like God, not only does the kingdom come about in this upside down way to what our sin nature sees as normal, but there's also, it's not like it's completely ridiculous, because he sets like little Easter eggs in creation that demonstrate this. Like one of the things that pops into my head that I didn't use on Sunday is how a forest needs fire, and how when a forest, when there's a control burn or a natural burn that happens, like that actually will produce life, and it's only when a seed falls to the ground that life can come. Like there's natural things in the natural world that God has created that point to these ideas. So they're not like counterculture. They're countercultural, not counter creation. And so that's important to remember, that it's because of our sin that's why it doesn't make sense to us. It's not God coming in and saying, I'm going to do things that just totally don't make sense, because then it'll take faith to believe in that. It's God is actually, the kingdom is coming about in the way that makes sense in light of creation, but it's our sin that perverts it and makes it seem like the wrong thing, or we feel like there's a better way to accomplish it. And ultimately that's the big thing about cultivating a culture, is otherwise we tend to want to bring about God's kingdom in a way that is dishonoring to the king. And because we want to do it because we think we know better. And that's not uncommon. And the disciples dealt with that. There are a few times where they're like, hey, so should we call fire down from heaven? And Jesus is like, what is wrong with you? Like, why would you think that would be the response after all you've seen from me? Or when Peter draws his sword, like, why would you think that would be the response? Well, it's so ingrained in us that they just kept thinking, well, at some point we're going to have to fight physically. Like Jesus has been compassionate and healing and doing all these things, but at some point we're going to take matters into our own hands. And that's just never, and so we have to embrace the upside down nature of the kingdom, because that's how Jesus has brought the kingdom.
Yeah, it's interesting how in our sin nature, that's a good clarifying comment too, by the way. But in our sin, we will try everything to bring that about. And then when we fail to bring it about, that's when we then say, okay, God, how would you want to do this? That's when we start praying, because we've tried all of our own what our human mind and our sin nature can conceive of to bring the kingdom about. And it doesn't happen because it comes about through God and his work. It makes me think too, Jay, of when the disciples you get this sense of like impatience, like with John the Baptist, like, why is this taking so long? Like you need to get this show going here, Jesus. You should be proclaiming this from we should make you king now. And he knew that it needed to come slowly and very deliberately through his action. But yeah, I mean, I think to me that's one of the other points you talked about was inside out change, and that the kingdom comes inside out. And those two things are so related, the upside down nature of the kingdom and the inside out nature of it.
Right, because we tend to think that that the appearance of holiness and that all of those outward displays and looking like we're religious, looking like we're happy, looking like that is the thing. Like whatever you do, you can't let anybody know that you're despairing or that you're concerned or that you're struggling with any kind of sin, because that's being a bad representative. And I'm thinking like, no, that when we're called to be ambassadors for Christ, what we are making the appeal for is to be reconciled to God. It's not we're ambassadors for Christ because we stand for all the right issues and we do all the right things. We're ambassadors for Christ because we are communicating the worthiness of our King, which is demonstrated in our humility, in our repentance, in our like soft-heartedness, in our being slow to speak, like quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. All of that demonstrates a trust in Christ, which that is what that is who we are an ambassador for, not for our own, not for our own morality. And so to do that, we need to be about that kind of that inside out change.
Yeah, which is so much different than just acting a certain way.
Right.
It's interesting how, I remember just growing up in the church and being, as a teenager, being very aware of the things that were off limits. Mm-hmm. And some of those, in hindsight, actually, it's very good they were off limits. Some of those were just cultural things that at the time were not allowed. And that consumed a lot of my thinking as a teen. What am I not to do? And that is part of following Jesus. There are certain things that's not part of our life anymore because we're in him. But man, is there much more positive that this is now what we are about. And that is what's meant to, I think, fill us and fill our mind and our thoughts as he works his life in us. You describe some of those character traits, and those character traits get lived out in all of our real life situations that we go through every day.
Yeah, I remember years ago when in our little church plant back in Colorado, our worship leader, I'd picked him up and we were going to set up everything in the little hotel conference room, and he was really struggling. And he just said, I don't have any joy right this morning, and I'm supposed to lead worship. And he said, what do I do? And in his mind, his options were, his first instinct was to just fake it and just say, well, I need to put on a positive face, put on a happy face, and get up there and act joyful. But we'd been together long enough that he knew that doesn't feel quite right. So he asked, he's like, I gotta be honest, I am not feeling joyful this morning. And he's like, so should I just fake it? And I said, well, I don't know if that sounds right. What are your other options? And he was like, well, I feel like the only other option is to get up there and just be miserable. And he goes, that doesn't seem right to try to lead worship and be up there and be all grumpy. And I'm like, yeah, fair point. That also doesn't seem like a great option. But the question of, in that inside out way or that upside down kingdom, is there a third option that we don't consider? And I think it's Keller who likes to point out the third way of the gospel, and how often the world sees well, it's got to either be this thing or this thing. So either you pretend that you're happy, or you just let everybody know you're miserable. And you're looking at that going, well, neither one of those seems very attractive. But there's a third way, which is in the confession of our lack of joy and in meeting God and feeling his presence there and reminding yourself of who you are and what the reality of the situation is, that you can just have faithful response in that. And so like what I encouraged, I said, especially, we had an intimate church family, and I said, I think it's okay. He ended up like just confessing, I'm struggling this morning. And, but I know these things to be true. And I know what we're doing here, and we're gathering together. And even the confession of that and the speaking it out to people then that he could receive mercy and kindness of God through them, because obviously it wouldn't shock you that our people did not respond with like, well, then get off the stage and what are you doing up there? Like, no, they were incredibly kind and merciful and gracious and understanding and empathetic, because there were people that had come that morning who were feeling that way.
Exactly.
And so now here they were like, so we're just going to declare these things because we know them to be true. Well, and what happens in there? Like, the people who are feeling joyful that day are singing all the louder because they know they need to, like, I'm going to minister to your soul right now, because I know we both agree on the same things. We know these things are true, but we're going to, but I'm going to like pick you up, and so I think that's what we're trying to go after. Is I've seen a lot of churches and that whole inside out idea, and I don't know what your experience has been. I know in campus ministry, it's a common thing everywhere, that you can be a part of a church family that just the culture is pretend everything's fine. Like, just be happy, put on a smiley face, be joyful because we are joyful in the Lord. And so we're going to be joyful, whatever the cost. And if I'm not feeling it, I'm not going to let anybody know. But then the other extreme that I've been a part of is when we're going to be identified by our sorrow. Mm-hmm. And that transparency equals kind of downtrodden and like pain and suffering, and everything's about that. And if you're not, like, if you're happy or joyful, then you're seen as disingenuous or not transparent because you're faking it.
Yep.
Neither of those are the options, but I'm just curious, like, have you been in those extremes, and how have you tried to help people? Like, what would you say to somebody who says, I'm not feeling very joyful. I don't know. Do I like, you're fighting the temptation? Because this is a long question, but I also want to preface it with, we all, I think, can get on board with saying, faking holiness so people will see you as holy, that is repulsive. And I think everybody, I don't know too many people who would say, oh, no, I think we should totally act like we're holy so other people will think we're holy even though we're not. I'm not necessarily talking about that situation. I'm just talking about like what our worship leader was dealing with, where you say, I know that my identity is in Christ, but I'm not feeling very joyful, and I don't know what to do with that. Like when I walk in the church or when I walk into a small group and somebody says, how are you? And I'm thinking like, I'm really struggling. But you also don't want to make it like a big thing. So you don't know whether, do I fake it? Do I say this or whatever? And then how do you guard against that becoming like, how transparency being equated with just essentially a form of spiritual grumbling and complaining, where like to be transparent means to complain about all the hard things that are happening.
Yeah. I've experienced both things. I think, both have their good intentions, I think, and both have liabilities. The faking holiness makes me think of like a child who's, pretending like they're sleeping and you can see their eyes moving. Like, people know, like, people can tell. And that's part of it, is like, we don't really fool anyone, especially not God, when we do that.
Right.
I love how you handled that conversation, by the way, just to back up on that a second. That it was
with the worship leader?
Yeah.
That's because I had no idea what to say to him.
Well, that's beautiful.
What do you think? Because I was like, I don't know what to tell you.
I think there's truth in that, though, because every single one of us is wired so differently. To me, the ultimate goal would be, let's shift our thinking and our mind from ourselves and move it to our King, like you mentioned earlier. So like, thinking about being a certain way and I should be this certain way, we end up unintentionally becoming very self-absorbed with how we are appearing and how other people are reacting to us. So part of it is just moving into this space where we make this about God. So for me, at least, because we all have those moments, right, where we feel maybe dry, or we feel like, man, my reaction to that, even though it didn't escape my mind, was not what I want it to be, right? I think whenever we have those moments and we immediately or soon after use that as an opportunity to connect with God actively, like to talk with him, that is the best possible thing, because that's what we're designed for in those moments. Whether the thing is going really well, I'm really feeling joyful, like that can result in us interacting with God and telling him, thank you for the joy you've given me on the day when, it's the end of January and the sun isn't shining for another day, and you feel it like, wow, I feel sad today. That's when we got to tell him, God, I really feel sad today. I want to worship you. I know there's tons to be thankful for. I just don't feel it. And whenever our human interactions can do that together, like you and I together, Jay, praying to God like that, even better. So that's what I would say is we are ourselves. Mm. We don't focus on that, like making it, this has got to be about me right now, but we can be honest with each other and then go to God together with it. That's one of the reasons, I love the Psalms. Everyone knows that by now. And that's one of the reasons I love the Psalms, because in one Psalm, you will have someone lamenting deeply, and then the next line talking about the steadfast love of the Lord that doesn't cease, and the praise that God gets because of that. But both things are real. It wasn't pretending to lament one minute and then the next minute being joyful. That's just human,
And we're complex even in the moment. Like it's not just a linear thing of he was doubting and then he's believing. Exactly. They're both fighting inside of him. And that often happens to us, which is one of the tricks in the church, is that, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you're just sharing, you're being transparent. You're just saying, man, I'm just feeling discouraged today. And then someone tries to fix it by either preaching a sermon to you or, or you look at, man, you sat up, you're like,
well, I've definitely had that happen. And especially in small group settings, sometimes really well-meaning people try to fix you. Yeah. And give you some advice. And man, there's a time when we might ask for advice, like, help me, what works for you? But usually in those moments, man, what we want is some empathy and, I've been there, and let's pray together. This is hard. And that's what we need typically. But
I think it's good to ask somebody what they need. So if you have somebody that just shares, man, I'm struggling with doubt right now, and to just say to them, hey, man, I'm sorry you're dealing with that. I know I can empathize with that. Like, how can I help you in that? Because sometimes when I've been struggling, I have a genuine question that I'm wrestling with. And then I could use some help. Like, I'll go to somebody and say, hey, could you help me understand this? Or could you explain to me how you think through, this suffering, the role of suffering, or, whatever. So sometimes it's like, I do want somebody to give me their thoughts on it. Then there are times where we just need to be reminded of something, and we can communicate that. Be like, hey, you know what I could really use right now? I could just use you reminding me of the gospel and just reminding me of our identity. Like, I know these things are true, but I just need to hear somebody preach it, somebody else to communicate it to me. I think that's one of the powers of music. So music that has a really, when we sing hymns and scripture saturated hymns that proclaim the gospel, or other songs, I have so often used those like that, where I'm like, I need to be reminded of what is true. And so I'll listen, or I'll read the Psalms or whatever. And then sometimes you might get a response when you say, hey, how can I help you? Is like, someone's just saying, I just needed to verbalize it. I needed to get it out there. Like, I know these things that are true. I just needed to confess that and make sure somebody else knows that was going on in my heart. And then that's where you just like, okay, man, I'm here. And you don't need to preach to them or anything like that. And that will cultivate a culture of transparency. Like, when you have a culture of, if you dare utter any doubt or insecurity or worry or anything like that, you're going to get met with a theological sermon or treatise on on why what you're doing is sinful or whatever like that, no one's gonna be transparent in that venue, because we're never like, if someone's struggling with doubt, they aren't like fully disbelieving. They're just struggling in that moment with that. And so, I think, yeah, like you said, not fixing that.
Well, I'm glad you said that, just the culture piece of that, because the more we're part of a culture, like kingdom-oriented culture, kingdom-saturated, right? The more we will realize in those moments, you and I have nothing we can really give a person. We can repeat things that God has said. We can listen really well, but then we know ultimately any sort of healing that might need to happen or encouragement is going to come from God's Spirit. It might come through something we say, but it's going to be God's Spirit who does that. And so to me, it makes me want to increasingly press into I need prayer for this. And then you pray for me, and then you say, and I could use prayer for this. And we pray for each other. We share those things with each other. And when we do it that way, where it's not just commiserating and complaining, it actually results in something really positive, like praying to God, who can do things like that, fix things and heal things. I think that you guard against some sort of navel gazing, or the opposite, just faking it. Especially when our prayers for each other become not primarily about circumstances, but about our heart and our trust.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, I think that's really good. I think cultivating a culture of that inside out and focusing on the heart and asking good questions, like, well, what do you want?
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to be true? And there's so many people, like, for example, if someone's worried about an upcoming medical test, I'm careful to not, like, God's in control, and, which is true, but also is flippant to somebody who knows that God is in control, but they're also genuinely they're afraid still, because we don't ever fully believe that. Even though we know that God is in control, we still don't fully comprehend what that means. Or I remember one time when I was worried about something, and I had somebody say that, I was my youth pastor, and I said, I know that God is in control. That's what scares me. Like, it was actually the issue of wondering, questioning, not like, is he good, or is he going to actually ask me to walk this hard road that I know will be good, but I don't want to walk it, and those are all legitimate feelings to have. But if you can ask, like, well, if someone's worrying, say, well, what do you, how can I help you? And then what do you want? And, sometimes that will help uncover what's actually going on. They might say, well, what I want is to stop worrying because I know God's in control, and I'm frustrated with myself that I'm worried about this thing. Now you're going to deal with that differently, be able to comfort them and help them, receive God's grace and mercy in that moment, versus they might say, like, well, what I want is for this test to come back negative. That's all I want. And they may, so much so that it may seem like such a silly question, but remember, Jesus asks those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, do you want to be healed? Like, what kind of a question is that? Well, because you have to say that and confess that. Like, what do you actually want? And because Jesus always has something better, but that's just another way you cultivate kind of that inside out heart change, is really is valuing the heart and really getting to the heart of what somebody, even if they say, like, they're struggling with a sin, like, it's a good question to ask. Well, what do you want?
Exactly.
Because do they want to be free of that sin? Do they want to be convinced that what they're doing is sin or not? Do they want to be okay with doing the sin? Like, do they want to be okay? Like, what do they want? Like, do you really want to be set free from this? Or do you want to stop feeling conviction over it? Or do you want to stop, like, what? There's so many things that could come out of that. And so I think not just focusing on the external fruit that's coming out, but to actually get down to the root of what's happening.
Yeah, didn't you talk about duct taping oranges to apple trees or something like that? And I think that's, obviously absurd enough that is what we end up doing, though, and it actually, I think when we live that way, where what is inside is so disconnected from what's outside, the tension that builds in our soul is so great. Like there's this, we are disintegrated and we're meant to be integrated whole people. And we have these things that we're doing externally that don't match our heart at all. And I mean, we're all in process. So none of us is going to be able to live all the time outward and model and image Christ. We just can't. But he is transforming us. He is actually doing that. And I think we need to expect that he will continue. It's a trust issue that he can continue to produce in us what we have had a really hard time doing. So whether it's, loving someone in our life who's just really challenging to love, we keep asking him, help me to do that. Help me to love from my heart this person that is so difficult, that's going to be part of my life. That's a story that I'm sure we could hear over and over again. We don't have to, we can trust that he will do something. Doesn't mean it's going to be easier. Like none of this is necessarily easy, but it's going to be better, way better.
Well, it is. And that connects both to it's worth it, but it also connects to the small to big idea of the kingdom. Because I was just thinking about this, that, the example that I shared on Sunday and is just really common is when somebody says, oh, man, I wanted to say this thing to this person, but I didn't. And there's a couple of ditches you can fall into. The most obvious one is then you see that as self-righteousness. Like you think that that's the fruit. The fruit is, that's what we're really going after but that's the appearance of holiness. Like not saying a cruel thing that you wanted to say that's not the end goal here. And, but on the other hand, you could just as easily fall into the ditch of not celebrating a small victory in that. Like that still can be an act of faith if you're confronting that. So every day basically I want to say something horrible to you, Jeff, and I like it's just like burrowing inside. So like
self-control,
right? So but there is a sense in which, well, obviously, I should not just say it just because I'm feeling it, right? So there is an act of faith that says, okay, I'm feeling this thing. I want to say this thing, but in faith, I'm going to not say it because I know that would be dishonoring to Christ. But then to not settle for that. Like that's the key, is there are always going to be times where, yes, you're going to have to do the proverbial biting of your tongue, whether it's in an action that you want to do that you don't, or you like stop yourself from going somewhere or looking at something or saying something or watching something, whatever the case is, there is going to be that like almost like a shock collar on a dog thing, but you do that as a step of faith and then look deeper and say, but that's not what I want. Like what I want is a new tree. Like I want new roots. I don't want to just rip off this fruit and duct tape something else on there so that it looks like an orange tree. I actually want to be transformed. And that's when you start to get at the heart issue, but you can celebrate like those small steps of faith. And where I used to struggle is I would either count the biting of my tongue as righteousness, or what often happened to me was I would still be covered in shame because of how I felt inside. And I'd be like, it would like double down on it because I'd think like, okay, well, I stopped myself, but you still wanted to say that, rather than like the way it should look is in faith, I'm going to bite my tongue. I'm going to thank God for the grace and thank him for protecting me from saying that thing that was evil in my heart. And I'm going to confront the evil that's in my heart and confess that and work on that and like ask him to root that out of me so that the next time I'm in that situation, Lord willing, eventually your hope is what flows out of your heart is something that's useful for building up and encouraging rather than something that's for evil. Mm-hmm. So that's a small, and to believe that those little steps, small steps of faith is what will bring about big transformation in our hearts, as opposed to what we often do, which is we just think like we want it to be big right away. So the classic of praying for patience.
Yep.
And just like, I just want God to magically make me patient one day. or I'm no longer impatient with anybody. That's not the way the kingdom takes root. It's in little, small, step-by-step acts of faith where you just slow down and you trust Jesus in that moment, and then the next day you trust him in another moment and another moment, and those little things like eventually will bear fruit.
Yeah, that's, to me too, what's kind of implicit in what you're saying is that this is all of our life all the time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like following Jesus doesn't fit into in a few hours a week. In order to do what you just described, we live with the knowledge that we are in God's presence all the time, and that the waking hours that aren't at church or not, in the Bible or not a quiet time, those are really crucial hours for our walk with him, because that's when this all happens, what you're describing. Now, maybe the processing will happen in a set aside time later, but the real living out the kingdom and the power of the kingdom and the values of the kingdom is happening when we're being a neighbor, or we're being a parent or a friend or a spouse or a coworker. That's when that all happens. To me, it's really encouraging, because that means that I get to be with him all the time. Like I get to experience, like, that's what's actually important about today. It wasn't that I would come in and have a staff meeting and then I'd record a podcast. Those are things I get to do while I'm living in the kingdom with Jesus today. That's the goal of the day. And those things flow out of that. That's just been really striking me lately, that sometimes our assumptions about when this all happens are so narrow. They're happening as we live.
Right. They are. And that's I was just thinking, this is probably, you could tear this analogy apart if you want to. But I was thinking about how that's the game. Like life is the actual game. If you think about like a sports analogy or sports metaphor, the time and the word and everything, that's like, eating healthy and resting and, all those different things that go into when the game actually starts and the athlete's out there. It'd be really weird if an athlete's like, yeah, I played terribly, but I ate really well. Like to be dismissive of what the game actually was, and to totally miss the point and say, yeah, but I practiced and I ate really well and I slept. I got a really great night's sleep last night. Like I've never heard a athlete, a quarterback in a post-game press conference after they threw 4 interceptions be like, but I went to bed early last night. As if that's like matters. Doesn't matter to the press. It doesn't matter. And I think there's an element of that we can feel very religious by getting up early, reading the Bible, praying, going to church on Sunday, doing all the things, and then we go and then we yell at our neighbor for a tree branch that's over the fence, or for their dog barking, or the cashier for ringing up something incorrectly, and just feel no connection at all. Like think that, no, but I honored God because I got up and had quiet time. And, but all of that was meant to prepare you for the thing, which is living and being salt and light here on earth in our everyday life and our everyday being and every interaction. All those other things were meant to prepare you for that. And so, do we fail in that? And yes. Do we sometimes fail because of a lack of preparation? Yes. Sometimes, an athlete's like, you know what? I didn't eat well today, and I didn't get any sleep last night. I stayed out late last night. Sometimes that is the reason, and sometimes it's other things. And we can always go back and say, you know what? I need to make sure I'm rested. Like I need to make sure that I'm at peace. I mean, think about that when you interact with a coworker or a neighbor. Think about all the things that contribute to whatever your response is about the barking dog. Like, how rested are you? And by rested, I don't mean just sleep. I mean, like, are you resting in Christ? Do you feel the peace of Christ in your heart? Is that ruling in your heart? Or is the chaos of the world ruling in your heart? Have you eaten well? Like, have you been in God's word so that you're reminded of your identity in him and his sovereignty over this? And like, are you practicing his presence and know that he's with you? Like, all of that preparation will help you in that moment of that really matters. And you're right. We tend to think of the preparation as the thing that matters, and it's not. And Jesus deals with this a lot, like especially when it comes to Sabbath. He's like, hey man, the whole point of Sabbath is like to restore you and rest so that you won't ignore your brother who's has, needs a heal, he needs his hand to be healed, or so you don't ignore the poor. And like your giving, for example, is meant so that you would have generous hearts and that you would be able to love the poor well, not so that you would feel like you did the thing just by giving and now you go out and ignore the poor. So I don't know if that. So there you go. You can.
I like that.
You
I do.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, it's
You're
the difference
so
between
encouraging.
making spiritual disciplines the goal,
Right.
or spiritual disciplines being the means, and to a bigger goal of living in the kingdom right now, all day long, and that's just very different. And I think all of us, we need to have these conversations because we all need the reminder. I could forget an hour from now that that's what I'm doing. I mean, it's just the way life is. We're all in process with God together as we do this.
We are, and it's worth it. I mean, that was so I use those as like bookends. Those 5. So we talked about how the kingdom is upside down, that it's inside, it works inside out, and these are all ways that these are statements about the kingdom, and primarily about how either characteristics of the kingdom or characteristics of how the kingdom takes shape and takes form. And so, it's upside down, it's inside out, it grows small to big. We talked about everyone's invited, which we didn't talk about here in the podcast, but we mentioned on Sunday, everyone's invited, but not all will come, which is like, that's kind of that two-headed coin. But all of that then is bookended by it's countercultural, upside down, and on the other end, it's worth it. Like, it is a treasure hidden in a field. And I was thinking about how those are all connected. And earlier you were talking about, I don't remember if it was actually on the podcast or before, we were talking about volunteers. Because I was thinking about the upside down nature of it and what feels countercultural. And immediately what popped into my head was asking for people to volunteer to do something, whether it's a service project or volunteering in the church or, going on a prayer walk or going on a missions trip or whatever it is, that when there's a lukewarm response to the ask, the cultural thing, our intuition tells us, like, we'll lower the bar, like make it easier for them to participate in it, and then we'll have more people that will participate in it. But the kingdom way is like the bar gets raised. Like whenever Jesus is like he raises the bar. When people leave, like he just keeps raising the bar, and that's because what you're doing in that kind of a culture is you realize, like, you're saying this is worth it. Like you're asking, like, if I'm having trouble finding volunteers for something, I'm not going to lower the bar. I'm going to raise it, because it's more likely that people, when they're talking about doing hard things, the question that most people are asking is it worth it? It's not, well, I would do it if you made that hard thing easier. Is it worth it? And so, like, when I'm dealing with young people that want to get married, I'm going to be honest with them. Marriage is hard, but it's worth it. Like, having children is difficult, but it's worth it. Being an overseas missionary is hard, but it's worth it. Like, you're never going to, I mean, imagine if we trained missionaries or tried to recruit missionaries by saying, oh, but you know what, with Skype and everything, you hardly even miss your family. And, lots of people support you, so you're not going to ever have to worry about money. And, like, the ministry's great. Like, here's all these great stories or whatever. It's actually really easy. Well, you might get more people at the beginning, but they're not going to last. Mm-hmm. The people who last, the people you want in the missions field, are you say, this is hard, but it's worth it. And that is ultimately the kingdom. When Jesus is laying this out, he's not saying any of this flippantly. He's not saying, like, oh yeah, this is gonna be totally easy to do this. But he's saying, like, that's why you have to die to yourself. Like, you pick up your cross and die to yourself and follow me. But he does it unapologetically because he knows what the Father's preparing. Like, he knows his Father. And if you know the Father and you know what he's preparing, then literally anything that you'd ask, that's, when the disciples tell him, we gave up all kinds of things for you. And he's like, you didn't give up anything. Like, there's nothing that you have given up that's not going to be repaid 10 times, 100 times. Like, it's like amazing when you think about, like, if we could come up with some kind of metaphor that would make something such a no-brainer, but that's what it is. Like, if you actually see the treasure of the kingdom, then anything that God would ask for you in any moment would seem like, well, yeah, what else? What else? Like if I told you I had $5 million sitting over for you, and I'm like, the thing is, you actually got to walk out to my car to get it. You're like, okay, what else do you need me to do?
Pretty easy.
Happy to do that. Like, oh, but you're gonna actually have to unlock my car. Yeah, okay, that's totally fine. Like, what's the catch? And if we really saw the kingdom for what it was, we would be asking God, like, what's the catch? Like, wait, this is who you're gonna say that I am, and this is what I receive from you, and this is who I get to be, and like what this is like. It's the classic too good to be true, but it's our sin that perverts the way we see things, and so we want to, we manipulate all of that. But yeah.
Well, and to me, that's where, again, this interaction with God is so important, because he's the one that helps us to see it for what it really is, and to see we all crave life in some way, right? We want life. We want it to the full, and we seek it in all the wrong places in our sin nature. We just do. We think this is going to bring me life, and we pursue it, and it doesn't. This person will, or this whatever, this thing I need to possess. And Jesus is redefining and helping us understand what will actually bring us life. And it has to do with him and his kingdom and his Father and being full of his Spirit. And that's something that he teaches us. I do think, like, when he called his first followers, some people didn't follow him. Right? They walked away. Yeah. But those who did so because they saw what was on offer as unbelievably valuable, and you'd be stupid to pass it up.
Right.
It wasn't because they had to.
Right. No.
It was, everything was worth leaving for him. And so we need to ask God to do that in us when we sense that our heart doesn't quite believe that, because there's all these moments, right? Is this worth it or not? We do that. Whether or not we say it explicitly, we do feel that. And that's where we ask him for help. Teach me, God. Instruct me. Show me. Fill me with a desire for what is really good, and help me to see in my life what is really not good and is not worth the time and the sacrifice that I give to it.
Yeah, so I would probably close with, that brings up another good diagnostic question. So earlier we asked, like, well, what do you want? I think asking the question of, well, what do I believe? Like, do I believe it's worth it? Asking that question has been so helpful in mine. Like when I'm battling sin, or when I'm like confronted with some of these things, like the question is, do I believe that the way of the kingdom is better? Do I believe it's worth it? And a lot of times in my heart, like, I have to confront the fact that I'm saying, well, it doesn't feel like it here. Like I'm looking at it and saying, man, walking out to the parking lot to get that treasure chest just seems like a lot of work that isn't worth it. I'd rather stay here where it's warm. I know it sounds stupid, but that's the perversion of our brains, that we would actually think that. But it's good to acknowledge that and realize that, to say, to press in. That will reveal some heart level issues when you're wondering, okay, why am I struggling to get up, for example, to just start my day, like spending some time with the Lord? Or why am I struggling to speak to my kids in a life-giving way? Like, what's going on there? Like, if I confront that and say, well, I know that this is the way Jesus would have me speak to them, but if I say, well, I'm not, well, do I think that the way of Jesus is worth it? Do I think it's better? And then I start to confront things. Well, no, because if I just do that, then they might still make these mistakes, or they might still, like, I'm confronting these things where I don't see the kingdom as a treasure hidden in a field. And that will reveal some of those hard things. So that goes back to that idea of the inside out way that the kingdom grows, and that in the confronting of that, that's how I actually grow and am sanctified. And so often we just leave it at the surface, because we think it's kind of like a student who wants an easy test. There's students who want a really easy test, and then there are students who want a challenging test, because the ones who want a challenging test are the ones who, I mean, sometimes it's because they want to prove like what they know, but in its best form, a student who wants a challenging test is the one who says, I really want to know this. Like, I want to make sure that I've learned this and I know it. So give me a hard test, so that'll reveal if there's something I don't know. Versus the person who's like, I don't really care if I learn this or not. I just want to pass the test. And I think spiritually we do that a lot, where we just say, okay, I don't really care if God brings patience in my heart. What I really want is to never have to have patience. So if you could just create a life for me that doesn't require any of that, I don't really care if I have true patience and that the peace of Christ is ruling in my heart. I just care that I can look like it and I can pass the test. So give me easy tests, and then I pass those, and then I feel good about it. Or we'll create our own test for it and say, like, see, I'm generous, I'm patient, I'm kind, I'm whatever. But the hard tests are in the Sermon on the Mount, like, how do you treat your enemies? Do you, the parable of the banquet in Luke 14 of, are you going to invite people who can pay you back? And Jesus will say things like, well, what credit is that? You're kind to people who are kind to you. You love those who love you. What credit is that to you? What we should want as Christ followers are the hard tests, because then that reveals, that's the kindness of God. Because if we think we have the peace of Christ, well, then when that gets tested, that reveals, oh, you know what? I snapped at my kids there. I don't have the peace of Christ ruling in my heart, and I can confess that, and I can pursue the peace that really will surpass, will be inexplainable and surpass understanding and all of that. That's what I really want. And so to get that, I need to be a student who wants hard tests. And I'm not saying ask for, I don't pray for suffering.
No.
I pray that God will show me there's merciful, kind, gentle ways he can show me that I'm lacking. I mean, it doesn't take much for me. Let's be honest. The peace of Christ, if I want that in my life, all it takes is someone cutting me off in traffic. All it takes is a child talking back to me. It doesn't take cancer necessarily to notice that. It's in really small things that we can notice it if we're attentive to it.
I mean, I really like what you're saying, because to me, it highlights the relational nature of all of this.
Yeah.
Too, that God is working something in us, and these are opportunities to walk with him through it. There's one book I really like called How People Change.
Yeah.
And the way he described it, much like what you just described, but that, heat, meaning circumstances that are challenging, when the heat goes up in our life, thorns can come out or fruit can come out, just like in the soil, right? Mm-hmm. Thorny things or fruit things. And God's design is that even the things that are so hard, they end up producing fruit. And some of the fruit could be what you just described, saying, yep, I feel that, God, and I see from you that this is lacking, and now I can work with you and ask you to help me with that area. And I wouldn't have known that before that guy cut me off. Even though my response wasn't what I wanted it to be, that's still a fruitful response in the end.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Yeah, and that kind of the relational approach, that is what we want to be as a church family. That's why we are God's family on mission, doing this together. So we want to encourage you to connect with one another around these things. Be honest. Find people in the family that you can be transparent with, and just practice confessing these things, and practice sharing the gospel with one another and reminding one another of who we are called to be, and that we're not already there yet, and we haven't arrived, and help us cultivate a culture where we do see the kingdom work in countercultural ways, but really beautiful ways. So there's ways that we can help you do that. Please reach out. You can email us, call us, chat with us on Sundays, and we would love to walk alongside of you in this journey. That's what we're here for. And so we hope that this has been helpful to you today. And until next time, grace and peace.